Bring in my next speaker, Mr. Charles Obila from the IGAD Secretariat. And Charles, really, I think so good to have that African voice in this conversation. For us, it is very important in Asia, simply because there is this strong bond that we have in terms of learning what Africa has in this context. So, Charles, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shabari. It's been very informative for me to listen to the other previous speaker. I must say I'm not going to speak anything new. Perhaps I'll repeat from majority of what has already been spoken to, but I'll try to give the regional perspectives, if I may say. IGAD, of course, is one of the regional economic communities in the Horn of Africa. We are a membership of 8 member states. And therefore, we are just a small proportion of the African countries. So it's 8 out of the 55 African states, a very small representation. So I would want to make a disclaimer that I'm not speaking for the African bloc per se, but I would guess that some of the experiences that I'm going to share will actually apply to the other countries in the African continent. When it comes to migration, of course, migration for us is just a means of survival. We cannot live without the options to migrate. But the reality is, again, despite the need and the functionality of migration to our daily subsistence, we are also in a context where we do not have, let's say, expanded opportunities for regular mobility. And for us, again, migration is a very dynamic in nature. Here, we really cannot differentiate, say, between refugees and migrants. We have the phenomenon of mixed migration, where you have different categories of people moving together using the similar means and perhaps looking for similar alternatives, mainly livelihoods and employment. Mobility in the region occurs largely within the region, but we also have migration to the Gulf countries. We also have migration to the European Union. And more closely, we have migration towards the southern part of Africa. Just so, again, it's mainly because of employment and income differentials, so people trying to look out for their livelihoods. In terms of the impact of COVID on migration, I would say one, with the onset of the COVID pandemic and the first cases in the region, of course, governments in the region largely responded in similar ways to the way other governments responded, in terms of lockdown, in terms of travel ban. And in terms of these, those who are mostly affected were those in the urban areas. And again, IGAD is so unique in the sense that the most resilient migrants are usually in the urban areas. And it's not just migrants, even the most resilient refugees are the ones who are in the urban areas. Those are the ones who are able to find employment, require limited support, and are able to support themselves and their families, and perhaps almost send remittances to their families back home. So when the lockdown came, of course, majority of those who are the most resilient ones are the ones who lost their jobs. They're the ones who lost their livelihoods. They're the ones who are mostly affected by COVID. But over and above that, in terms of the regional dynamics, again, there are some things that came into play. One, from the onset, there was the fear of the foreigner, mainly the narrative that the foreigners were the ones who are spreading the virus. And therefore, there was some tendency to point out at migrants and point out at those who are not considered natives as the perpetrators or those who are spreading the virus. And that in itself also played to the vulnerability of the migrants themselves, whereby most of them were targeted and they could not move over and above the restrictions. We also had a lot of deportations, largely within the region, countries in the region. So you'd have neighboring countries trying to deport migrants of a certain country. So you want to take them back to where they came from, largely because you thought they were the ones who were spreading the virus. We also had a lot of involuntary returns and deportation from other regions, mainly the Gulf countries and partly from the Southern Africa. And that has grown, though we've seen over time now, there's been some discussions on how to coordinate better to conduct the returns, largely because, again, you're returning people to areas where perhaps the testing capacities are still very low. The beds capacities in hospital or the health services are strained. So there was the need to agree on a more coordinated approach to returns or to having people go back in a safe and regular manner. This, I can say, has been some of the initiative or the efforts to promote that international cooperation and dialogue in the current health emergency phase. But this is to say that not all the needs have been addressed. Of course, we've also had a huge pileup of stranded migrants, particularly in majority of urban areas in the Horn of African countries. This is because, of course, most of them are working in the private sector, but because of the lockdown and the travel bans, they're not able to find employment, or they're not able to travel back to their home countries. So you have a lot of floating masses, if I may call, of those stranded migrants. The other thing that we've seen in the region is, again, initially we had these flows, internal flows of people moving from rural areas to look for employment in urban areas. But because of the COVID pandemic itself, you're almost seeing like a reversal of that flow. So we are seeing more people wanting to move back to the rural areas where perhaps the areas are not so congested. You might do the social distancing, the contacts are not as high, and the COVID cases are much lower. So that is how we are seeing it. But perhaps to bring it forward, and in terms of how we've seen the responses going on, one is there was a political leadership or a political decision that was taken by the heads of states in the IGAD countries, where they came together to develop or to adopt a regional health response strategy. And one thing that was unique, they specifically mentioned the integration of vulnerable population, including migrants and refugees, in the health responses. So that was one innovative approach. And over and above that, we've also seen the support from external partners like the EU, Sweden, Swiss, coming in to support such initiatives to ensure that no one is left behind, and we are integrating everyone in the countries or in the territories where they are currently hosted. And I would see, again, that is like some show of solidarity and international cooperation in addressing the COVID pandemic. But if I might reflect it further, perhaps for me, what I look at is the current phases. We are currently in the health emergency phase. We don't know for sure how long this will play out, but we are hoping that there will be perhaps the recovery and the post-recovery phase. It's just that we don't know the timing of this. But what I want to say is that I see the need for international cooperation, or the true test of multilateralism or international cooperation will be in the recovery and post-recovery. Why I'm saying so is, of course, the pressure to migrate will be there because people have lost their jobs, remittances have declined, so there'll be need to support more, because 60% of remittances into the region was going into basic services like food, shelter, health, education, and so forth. But now that has now declined, and people have been brought back, the returnees and the deportees. They're coming back to an environment of scarcity. So in the recovery and in the post-recovery phase, there'll be some pressure, the migratory pressure that will be there. There'll be more people will be looking out for opportunities. They'll want to move around to look for opportunities, both for employment and for their livelihood. And therefore, the need for international cooperation, or how governments will react to the governance of migration, will be determined more during the recovery phase. I'm saying this with a lot of caution because, again, we've lived through the similar experiences. For example, we know the framing of the migration crisis in 2015 was not necessarily a crisis because of the numbers of those people who were moving, but it was in the crisis because of the approaches the governments took towards migration. So if you're going to adopt a similar approach currently, when we really have the need and the pressure for people to move in order to find opportunities and jobs in whatever territory, then I see that majority of those who would have the highest need to move would not be able to move. And this would perhaps drive people either to move in irregular ways, drive people to look for services of smugglers, if I may say. We will see high cases of trafficking, not just within the region, but also between the regions, say, for example, the Horn of Africa and the EU, or the Horn of Africa and the Gulf countries. But it also provides an opportunity in a way. If we can harness the political will, if somebody would rise beyond the national sovereignty, beyond the checks, and ensure that we really have expanded opportunities for migration, and ensure that in as much as we want to phrase the narrative, the crisis narrative, we determine the end in such a way that it is to move those who are most vulnerable out of their vulnerability and to allow them to find some form of self-reliance. Then I would see perhaps us giving life to the global compact for migration in itself, and really ensuring that perhaps we give true meaning to migration as a poverty eradication strategy. Of course, here again, it depends with how member states will react. I'm not sure, I would not say for certain that this will happen. But I must say that for the African continent in a great way, the momentum was already there. In 2018, the African heads of state adopted two critical protocols, one on the continental free movement regime and the one on continental free trade area. So this was opening up opportunities for Africans within the African territory. But now COVID has come in, borders are closed. We are going to have perhaps stringent measures to allow for mobility. If these curtails the already existing and limited opportunities for mobility, then again, that might not really bring to light the ideals that the African states had set on course. That will drag us back. And of course, again, when it comes to the issues of remittances, that has already gone down, and we know kids are not going to schools. Refugees who are dependent on remittances, right now, their rations have been cut mainly by the humanitarian agencies, and they are not receiving enough remittances. Again, there is pressure not just from migrants themselves, but also from the refugees. And in the region, at the moment, we host close to 12 million displaced population, comprising of 8 million IDPs and 4 million refugees. So you can imagine that pressure alone for these people to find livelihood. That would put additional pressure, not just on the host countries, but on the transit and destination countries. So this, in a way, for me, it calls for that international solidarity. But again, it's just a matter of how we will phrase the migration narrative going forward. If we phrase it as a crisis, then we will lose the opportunity. But if we phrase this as a poverty eradication strategy, then I think we can give light to the global compact on migration. Right. As I conclude, I would want to touch on three issues again. One is, now we are also moving towards not the health emergency, but the recovery phase where you're talking about livelihood, food security, and most importantly, peace and security. Because the issues of transnational crime, radicalization into terrorism and what have you, all these are going to come into play. And perhaps for us, the African continent, 2020 is also a unique year in the sense that this is the year that the EU and AU, the African Union and the European Union, are supposed to hold the Continental Summit. The last one in 2015, of course, brought into light the discussions of migration. So it will be interesting to see how migration will be featured in the current pandemic phase or in the current crisis phase. Shabari, I would want to stop here and perhaps I'll contribute more in terms of the questions from the participants.
Thanks so much, Charles. You know, I have been such a horrible moderator. I have not been close to telling anybody with regards to sticking to time, simply because I have been so engaged in just listening to everybody myself. Such important points. You know, I'm just thinking, when you were saying about the migration crisis in 2015, that the approach, that this was not because of a crisis necessarily, but because of the approach that governments took to migration in general. And that's, I think, very important to note. So that leads me to say then, migration crisis in 2015, where was, as per this approach that you were saying that governments were taking, where exactly were these migrants heading to? And that specifically was majority of them going to Europe, with the understanding that even now we have to always say that 80% of migrants in Africa move within Africa. Not all of them are catching boats to Europe. That is not the case. You know, unfortunately, I think that conversation is still very difficult, and perhaps we are not communicating it in the right manner as well. So with